The morning sun streamed through the enormous windows of the Park Avenue apartment, illuminating a living room decorated with contemporary art and Italian designer furniture. Robert Ashton held his coffee cup as he watched the bustle of New York City below. At 42, he had built a tech empire, transforming a small startup into one of the country's most valuable companies. His estimated fortune of $120 million was the result of sleepless nights, sacrifices, and a brilliant mind for business. But on that Saturday morning, Robert wasn't thinking about spreadsheets or investments. His phone vibrated on the coffee table, and an instant smile lit up his face when he saw the name on the screen, Julia Matthews. The message simply read, "Good morning, my love. I dreamed of you all night." Robert felt his heart race like a love-struck teenager. Julia had had this effect on him since the first day they met, 6 months ago, at a charity fashion event. She was everything Robert had never imagined he'd have by his side. Julia Matthews, 28, a professional model with campaigns for major brands, a face that graced magazines, and a body sculpted by hours at the gym and strict diets. Long blonde hair, green eyes that seemed to capture the light, and a smile he found absolutely enchanting. When she agreed to go out with him that first night, Robert could hardly believe his luck. The first few months were like a dream. Julia showered him with affectionate messages, told him he was different from all the men she had ever known, that she had finally found someone with substance, with values. Robert, a naturally discreet and reserved man, found himself opening his heart in ways he never had before. He told her about his humble childhood in a small town in Ohio, about how he came to New York with just $1,000 in his pocket and a dream of starting a business. Julia listened to everything attentively, held his hand, and said she admired him deeply. 4 months after their first date, Robert proposed to Julia during a romantic dinner at a restaurant overlooking Central Park. He had planned every detail: rose petals, a live violinist, a diamond ring that cost more than many apartments. Julia said yes through tears that Robert interpreted as genuine happiness, and he felt his life was finally complete. Now there were only 2 weeks left until the wedding. The ceremony was to be held at a historic mansion in the Hamptons, with 200 guests, including business leaders, celebrities, and even some public officials. Julia was radiant with the preparations, choosing every detail of the decor, the menu, and the wedding dress that had cost $80,000. Robert paid for everything without hesitation, happy to see the joy in her eyes. His closest friends, however, had their reservations. Michael, his business partner of 15 years, had made subtle comments about the age and interest gap between Robert and Julia. "You're from very different worlds," Michael had said one night over dinner. "You like literature, she likes parties. You want to watch documentaries, she wants to go clubbing. Are you sure about this?" Robert always replied with the same conviction. "Opposites attract. Julia is teaching me to be lighter, more fun, and I'm teaching her about deeper things. It's a perfect balance." But there were moments when Robert felt small discrepancies. When he suggested a weekend browsing a bookstore followed by a quiet dinner, Julia would wrinkle her nose and suggest a party at a trendy club. When he commented on a fascinating documentary about astrophysics, she would change the subject to talk about a new collection from a French designer. Robert always justified these differences as part of the relationship's diversity. After all, Julia always ended their conversations with a long kiss and an "I love you so much." And that seemed to be enough. That morning, as Robert prepared his coffee, he thought about what life would be like after the wedding. Julia had mentioned wanting to continue her modeling work, but also start some personal projects, perhaps opening a clothing boutique or a spa. Robert had already promised to finance any dream she had. He imagined dinners at home, deep conversations about life, maybe even children in the future. The image made him smile. His phone rang again. It was Julia, asking to spend the afternoon with her. "I need you here with me, my love. I'm choosing the last few things for the wedding, and I want your opinion on everything." Robert replied that he would be there in an hour. He took a quick shower, put on a light blue dress shirt and tailored trousers. Even on a casual Saturday, Robert maintained a polished appearance, though he admitted he wasn't exactly what one would call a heartthrob. He had a slight belly, a consequence of years spent sitting in offices and meetings, and his hair was beginning to thin at the crown. But Julia always said she found him charming, that his intelligence and success made him the most attractive man she knew. Robert went down to the garage where he kept his car collection. He had a late-model Mercedes, a BMW convertible, and even a Ferrari he rarely used. But he also had simpler cars, including a discreet black sedan, he often used when he wanted to go unnoticed. That day he called his private driver, Mr. Anthony, a 60-year-old man who had worked for him for 5 years. "Good morning, Mr. Anthony. We're going to pick up Miss Julia." The driver nodded with a respectful smile and opened the rear door of the Mercedes. During the drive to Julia's apartment on the Upper East Side, Robert checked work messages on his tablet, but his mind was divided. Part of him was excited about the impending wedding, while another part felt an unease he couldn't name. It was like a voice whispering in the back of his mind, but he ignored it, attributing it to normal pre-wedding jitters. When they arrived at Julia's building, she came down looking radiant, wearing a tight white dress that highlighted every curve of her body. Robert got out of the car to hug her, and she kissed him enthusiastically in front of the driver, who discreetly looked away. "My love, you look handsome," she exclaimed, running a hand over his face. "I'm so happy we're doing this together. You're the man of my life." Robert felt his chest swell with emotion. Any doubts that might have existed dissipated when she spoke like that. He held her hand the entire way to the caterers, where they were making the final menu adjustments. Julia talked excitedly about the flowers, about the award-winning photographer they had hired, about the dress that would be the envy of all her friends. Robert agreed with everything, happy just to see her so thrilled. That night, after dropping Julia off at home, Robert returned to his apartment and poured himself a 30-year-old single malt scotch. He sat in his favorite armchair, the brown leather one he'd had since his days in their 2-bedroom apartment, and opened a book of poetry by Robert Frost. It was his Saturday night ritual, something that calmed him and connected him to a more sensitive part of himself. Julia had never understood his love for literature. Once, she had seen the shelf full of classic books in his office and remarked, "Did you really read all of this? It must be so boring." Robert had laughed at the time, saying it was a matter of taste. But now, alone with his scotch and his book, he allowed himself to wonder if they could truly be happy, with such different interests. Then his phone lit up with another message from Julia. "I miss you already. I can't wait to be your wife." And all his doubts vanished again like mist in the sun. Monday arrived with a typical New York overcast sky, threatening rain at any moment. Robert woke up early as usual, did his workout routine in his private gym, and took a refreshing shower. He had important meetings in the morning, and in the afternoon he had promised to take Julia to choose their permanent wedding bands. There were now only 12 days until the wedding, and every detail had to be perfect. While eating his breakfast of fresh fruit, whole wheat toast and natural orange juice, Robert reviewed the company's financial reports on his tablet. The numbers were excellent as always, but his mind was already split between work and the final wedding preparations. He had decided to take the entire last week before the ceremony off to dedicate himself to the final adjustments, and most importantly, to enjoy his final moments as a fiancé with Julia. Around 8 in the morning, his phone rang. It was Mr. Anthony, his driver. Robert answered while chewing a piece of papaya. "Good morning, Mr. Anthony. Are you on your way?" On the other end of the line, the driver's usually steady voice sounded weak and tired. "Good morning, Mr. Ashton. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I need to ask a favor. My wife fell ill during the night. She has a very high fever. I took her to the hospital in the early hours, and the doctors have asked for her to stay for observation today. I was wondering if you could give me the day off to be with her." Robert felt a pang of genuine concern. Mr. Anthony was more than an employee. He was someone who had been with him for years, knew his routine, his tastes, and had always been extremely dedicated and loyal. "Of course, Mr. Anthony. Don't worry about a thing. Your wife is the priority. Do you need any help? Would you like me to recommend a private doctor?" The driver thanked him emotionally, saying that everything was under control, but that he really needed to be by his wife's side. Robert ended the call, wishing her a speedy recovery, and stood there for a moment thinking. He would have to take an Uber to his meetings or ask someone from the company to send a substitute driver. It wasn't a big problem, just a minor inconvenience. It was then that Robert had an idea. An idea that, at the moment, seemed like nothing more than a harmless prank, almost a bit of mischief. He remembered that Julia had scheduled a long session for that afternoon at the most exclusive spa in New York, a place where she would spend 4 hours getting facials, massages, and other beauty treatments. She had mentioned she was going with one of her friends. Robert always sent Mr. Anthony to pick her up after these sessions. What if I go pick her up myself? Robert thought, a playful smile appearing on his face. But disguised as the substitute driver. The idea excited him in an unexpected way. It would be a fun surprise for Julia, a funny story to tell in the future. He imagined her reaction when she found out, the laugh they would share together. Robert picked up his phone and sent a message to Julia. Love, Mr. Anthony had a family emergency today and won't be able to pick you up from the spa. I'll send a substitute driver at 5 p.m., okay? Enjoy your day. Julia replied almost immediately with several heart emojis and a, "That's fine, my love. You're so thoughtful." The rest of the morning was spent in meetings. Robert met with his partners, discussed new investments, approved budgets, and resolved operational issues. But a part of his mind was entertained with planning his little prank. Around 3 in the afternoon, he wrapped up his commitments and went home to get ready. In his bedroom closet, Robert opened a section he rarely used where he kept casual clothes for informal occasions. He chose a pair of dark blue jeans, a simple black polo shirt, and basic white sneakers. No expensive brands or flashy details. He found a black baseball cap in the back of a drawer and a pair of aviator sunglasses. He put everything on and looked at himself in the mirror. The transformation was surprising. The millionaire businessman in bespoke suits and Swiss watches had vanished. In his place was an ordinary man, someone who could work as a rideshare driver or an employee at any company. Robert had decided not to shave that day, and the stubble on his face helped complete the disguise. He even changed his posture, slightly hunching his shoulders and relaxing the confident, upright expression he normally maintained. Robert went down to the garage and walked past his luxury cars to the discreet black sedan. It was a model from a few years back, well-maintained but with no apparent luxury, perfect for the role he intended to play. He got in, adjusted the seat and mirrors, and pulled out of the garage feeling strangely excited about the prank. The New York traffic was chaotic as always, but Robert knew shortcuts that Mr. Anthony had taught him over the years. He arrived at the exclusive spa on Madison Avenue at exactly 5 o'clock. The establishment was discreet from the outside, just an elegant door between other sophisticated shops, but Robert knew that inside was a paradise of luxury where treatments could cost thousands of dollars. He parked in a nearby spot and waited. He turned the radio to a news station and adjusted his cap and sunglasses. His heart was beating a little faster than usual. There was something adolescent about the situation, something adventurous that he hadn't felt in a long time. Robert Ashton, the man who commanded meetings with hundreds of employees, who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, was there, disguised as a driver to play a prank on his own fiancée. At 5:15, the spa door opened, and Julia came out accompanied by a friend Robert recognized from her social media. Her name was Camilla, also a model, also blonde, also slender. They were both wearing designer clothes and laughing loudly as they walked toward the car. Julia had a shopping bag in one hand and her phone in the other, completely absorbed in some conversation. Robert got out of the driver's seat and stood by the car, keeping his head slightly down and the sunglasses covering much of his face. "Good afternoon. I'm here to pick up Ms. Julia Matthews," he said in a voice slightly different from his own, a bit deeper and less articulate. Julia barely glanced at him. "Oh, right. You must be the replacement." She didn't even stop typing on her phone. "Can you open the trunk? Camilla, put your stuff in there too. We're going to stop by the mall before we go home." Robert felt a slight pang of disappointment. He had hoped Julia would at least look at him, maybe notice something familiar even through the disguise. but she simply got into the back seat with her friend, and they both continued their conversation as if he were invisible. Robert put the bags in the trunk and got back into the driver's seat. "Which mall would you ladies like to go to?" he asked, maintaining a professional and distant tone. "The shops at Columbus Circle," Julia replied, without even looking up from her phone. "And you can turn on the air conditioning, it's unbearably hot." Robert turned on the AC and started driving. Through the rearview mirror he could see the two women in the back seat. Julia finally put her phone away and turned to Camilla. "I desperately need a drink after that session. That massage was divine. But I'm exhausted." Camilla laughed. "You and your things. How can you be exhausted after being pampered for 4 hours?" "It's different, sweetie. It's tiring being beautiful," Julia replied with a smirk, and they both laughed loudly. Robert drove in silence, just observing through the rearview mirror. Neither of them seemed to care about his presence, as if he were just part of the car, a necessary but irrelevant accessory. The two began to chat about the treatments they'd had, about beauty products, about other friends in their social circle. Robert listened with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. It was strange to see Julia in this context, away from him, just being herself with a friend. She seemed lighter, more natural, different from how she was when they were together. The traffic was slow, and the conversation in the back seat flowed. Julia commented on a dress she wanted to buy at the mall. Camilla talked about a suitor who was pursuing her. It was trivial, superficial conversation, exactly the kind of thing Robert imagined they would talk about. He started to relax, thinking that perhaps there was nothing interesting to discover here, that he would soon arrive at the mall, reveal his identity, and they would all laugh about the prank. But then Camilla asked a question that would change everything. "So, Jules, how many days until the big day? Are you excited?" Robert saw Julia make an expression in the rearview mirror that was hard to decipher. She let out a short, almost sarcastic laugh. "Excited is a strong word, honey." Robert's heart leaped into his throat. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, but continued driving normally, his eyes fixed on the traffic ahead. Camilla seemed surprised by the answer. "What do you mean? You're getting married in less than 2 weeks." Julia sighed deeply, and Robert held his breath, every fiber of his being now tuned into the conversation unfolding in the back seat. The silence inside the car felt too dense, as if the air had turned solid. Robert kept his eyes fixed on the traffic, but every cell in his body was focused on the conversation happening in the back seat. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles began to ache, but he couldn't show any reaction. He had to remain invisible, just another anonymous driver in the chaos of New York City. Julia adjusted her hair and looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Look, Camilla, I'm going to be honest with you because you're a real friend. This wedding is more of a strategy than anything else." She spoke softly, but with enough clarity for each word to reach Robert's ears like a sharp blade. Camilla leaned forward, visibly intrigued. "A strategy? Jules, what are you talking about? Robert seems like a really nice guy. He's so polite every time I see you with him." Julia let out a dry laugh that Robert had never heard before. "Nice? Of course he's nice. He's also boring, old, and completely dull. Camilla, the man is 42, and his favorite weekend activity is watching documentaries about God knows what." "Documentaries? Who does that?" Robert's chest tightened. He always talked with such enthusiasm about the documentaries he watched, sharing facts he found fascinating. Julia always listened with a smile on her face, saying she loved it when he talked about his passions. All a lie. "And that's not all," Julia continued, her voice taking on an irritated tone. "He wants to go to bookstores on the weekends." "Bookstores, Camilla? Who's 28 and wants to spend a Saturday afternoon in a bookstore? I want to go to parties, go clubbing, meet interesting people, have fun." But no, Robert prefers to stay home reading poetry or watching some subtitled French film that nobody understands. Camilla seemed torn between shock and curiosity. "But then why are you marrying him?" "I'm not judging you, Jules, I just want to understand." Robert could barely breathe. The street ahead seemed blurry, but he blinked quickly and kept the car steady. A horn blared behind him, and he realized the light had turned green. He gently pressed the accelerator, his hands trembling imperceptibly on the wheel. Julia turned completely towards Camilla, and Robert could see the expression on her face in the rearview mirror. There was no regret there, only a kind of cold pragmatism. "Because Robert is worth $120 million, Camilla. $120 million. The number echoed in the car like thunder. Robert felt his stomach churn. Camilla's eyes widened. "Wow, I knew he had money, but I had no idea it was that much." "Exactly," Julia said with a smile that Robert would later classify as predatory. "And I've done my research. I've talked to lawyers, to friends who've been through this. If I can stick out this marriage for 2 years, just 2 years, and then file for divorce, I walk away with at least 40 million, maybe even 50, depending on how I play my cards." Robert felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Her words weren't those of someone in love or confused. They were calculated, cold, planned. Every declaration of love, every kiss, every intimate moment he had treasured in his heart, it was all part of a financial plan. "Are you serious?" Camilla asked, her voice wavering between admiration and disbelief. 2 years of your life?" "2 years is nothing," Julia replied firmly. "Think about it. I've been modeling since I was 18. That's 10 years of walking runways, crazy diets, chasing campaigns, competing with younger and younger girls. And for what? To save a few. 100,000? Maybe 1 million or 2 if I'm really lucky. That's working until I'm 35 if I'm lucky, because after that age the industry throws you out like trash." Robert heard every word, his heart breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. He had always known that a modeling career had an expiration date, but he never imagined that Julia saw their marriage as an early retirement plan. "Now think," Julia continued, her voice gaining enthusiasm as if explaining an excellent business deal. 2 years of pretending I like documentaries and quiet dinners, 2 years of smiling and saying I find him interesting when he talks about stocks and investments, 2 years of sharing a bed with a man who's getting a gut and going a bit bald. In return, I walk away with 40 or 50 million, clean. It's the best investment I could ever make, better than any stock." Robert had to make a conscious effort not to slam on the brakes. A gut and a bit bald. The words cut deeper than he expected. He had always been insecure about his appearance, especially next to Julia. But she always said she found him attractive, that she loved him exactly as he was. More lies. All lies. Camilla was silent for a moment, processing everything she had heard. Finally, she asked, "What if he gets suspicious? I mean, 2 years is a long time to pretend." Julia laughed out loud, a genuine, amused laugh that made Robert's blood boil. "Robert? Suspicious? Camilla, please. That man is the most naive person I've ever met. He's needy, desperate for validation from a young, beautiful woman. I can say anything, and he believes it. I tell him I think he's the most interesting man in the world, and he lights up, like a kid who got candy. It's almost pathetic." The words fell on Robert like molten lead. Naive, needy, desperate, pathetic. He had always prided himself on his intelligence, his ability to read people and situations in business. How had he not seen it? How had he let love blind him so completely? "And look," Julia said, her voice taking on an almost philosophical tone, "I don't feel bad about it at all. You know how many women in our circle do the exact same thing. Fernanda married that 60-year-old businessman because she wanted a penthouse in Miami. Patricia stayed with a guy she hated for 5 years just to secure alimony. The difference is they're hypocrites. They pretend it's true love, that it's forever. At least I'm honest with myself about what I'm doing." Camilla still looked stunned. "And you never feel anything for him? No affection? Does he at least treat you well?" Julia shrugged. "He treats me very well, actually. He's kind, attentive, gives me everything I ask for without question. He even has a romantic side with those old-fashioned gentlemanly gestures. If he were rich and also interesting, maybe I could even genuinely like him. But life isn't a fairy tale, Camilla, it's a business, and I'm making a very good deal." The shops at Columbus Circle was close, but Robert no longer wanted to go there. He didn't want to prolong this. He didn't want another second in the presence of this woman he thought he knew and loved. His mind was racing, processing the pain while trying to decide what to do. "But won't Robert want a prenup?" Camilla asked. "We already have one," Julia replied. "But my lawyer looked it over. After 2 years of marriage, the agreement is practically worthless. The law in New York is very protective of the spouse, especially if I can prove I contributed to his wealth in some way. And believe me, I will contribute. I'll show up at events with him. I'll play the part of the perfect wife. I'll help improve his public image. That's all worth money and can be argued in the divorce." Robert felt nausea rise in his throat. Every detail was planned. It wasn't an impulse, not a momentary doubt. It was a meticulously constructed plan, with lawyers, strategies, and defined timelines. He was just a target, a business transaction disguised as a romance. His voice came out before he could think better of it. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, still maintaining the deep, different tone. "I'll need to make a quick stop before the mall. An urgent matter." Julia barely paid attention. "Fine, but be quick. We don't have all day." Robert diverted from the route to the mall and began driving toward downtown Manhattan, specifically to the area where the city clerk's office was located, where he and Julia had filed their marriage license application. His heart was beating so hard he could feel the pulse in his neck. His hands were no longer shaking. In fact, he felt a strange clarity, as if he were waking from a confusing dream and finally seeing reality. In the back seat, Julia continued chatting with Camilla about other things now, complaining about a friend who wasn't invited to the wedding, laughing at some gossip. For her, that revealing conversation was already in the past. For Robert, it was the moment that would define the rest of his life. The New York traffic seemed to conspire against Robert, each red light forcing him to remain longer in that car, listening to the conversation that systematically destroyed everything he believed about his relationship. He was now driving on autopilot, his brain torn between the searing pain in his chest and the need to maintain the composure of an anonymous driver. Camilla had changed the subject, but Julia seemed energized by the previous conversation, as if she could finally be honest about something she had been holding back. "You know what's funny?" she said suddenly, returning to the topic Robert both craved and dreaded. "Robert thinks I'm this deep woman he's slowly discovering. The other day he gave me a book of poetry that famous American poet, I can't remember his name, and he stood there explaining each poem to me as if it were the most important thing in the world." "And did you read it?" Camilla asked with a half-smile. Julia laughed loudly. "Of course not. I left it on the bookshelf in his apartment and he thinks I read it and loved it. I just have to say, wow, that's so profound every now and then, and he's on cloud 9. Men like that are so easy to manipulate, Camilla. They don't want a real woman. They want someone who makes them feel smart and important." Robert remembered that moment perfectly. It was a book by Robert Frost. He had spent hours choosing the perfect edition, with a hardcover and beautiful illustrations. He wrote a dedication on the first page about how those poems made him think of her, how each verse took on new meaning since he'd fallen in love. Julia had hugged the book to her chest and said it was the most special gift she had ever received. Another lie. Always lies. Robert gripped the steering wheel even tighter, feeling his nails dig into his palms. He wanted to scream, to stop the car right there and confront her, but a rational part of his brain kept him in control. He needed to hear everything. He needed to understand the full extent of the betrayal before he acted. Every word was a stab, but it was also a necessary truth. "What about his friends?" Camilla asked. "Don't they suspect anything?" "Oh, they suspect all right," Julia admitted. "Especially that Michael, his partner. That guy doesn't like me one bit. He's always looking at me with that suspicious face whenever we meet. But Robert always defends me. He says Michael is just overprotective, that it's a friend's jealousy seeing the other one happy. It's kind of cute in a pathetic way." Robert remembered the conversations he'd had with Michael. His friend had warned him about red flags, about the rush of the relationship, about the fundamental differences between them. Robert had accused him of being negative, of not being able to believe that someone like Julia could be genuinely interested in him. Michael had tried to be gentle, saying only, "I hope you're right." Now Robert knew he wasn't. The car stopped at another red light. Robert watched the two women in the back seat through the rearview mirror, Julia was now scrolling through her phone, probably on social media, while Camilla looked out the window. It was such a normal, everyday scene. No one looking at that car would imagine the drama unfolding inside. "Do you already have plans for after the divorce?" Camilla asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. Julia's eyes lit up. "I have a whole list. First, I'm going to travel the world for 6 months. Real places, not those boring cultural trips Robert likes. I want Ibiza, Mykonos, Dubai, places where life happens, where there are good parties and interesting people. Then I'll start my own business, maybe a cosmetics or clothing line. With 40 million, I can do whatever I want." "And relationships?" Camilla teased with a smile. Julia shrugged. "Then I can finally date whoever I want. Young, handsome, fun men. Not that I'll be getting married again anytime soon. I've learned it's better to keep things casual when you have your own money. Marriage was good for this phase of my life. But afterward, I want freedom." Robert felt the air leave his lungs. She had it all planned out, even what she would do after destroying his life. He thought of all the romantic dinners, of all the times he had opened his heart to her, shared his deepest fears and dreams. It had all been collected as information, filed away, and used strategically against him. Each word was like a hammer shattering the last pieces of Robert's heart. He had imagined an entire future with her. Children, perhaps. A family built on love and companionship. Growing old together, traveling the world not as tourists but as explorers of life. He saw himself teaching his children to read, sharing with them his love for books and knowledge. And Julia would be by his side, smiling, happy with the life they had built together. All an illusion. All based on carefully constructed lies. "I'm not going to lie," Julia said, her voice taking on an almost confessional tone. "Sometimes I feel a little bit sorry for him. Robert is so in love, so genuine in everything he does. He really believes in this fairy tale love. Yesterday he sent me a message saying he can't wait to wake up next to me every day for the rest of his life. It's almost cruel what I'm doing." Robert felt tears sting his eyes but blinked them away quickly. Not here, not now, he had to maintain control. That message had been sent at 3 in the morning when he had woken up from a dream about her and couldn't go back to sleep, so full of love and gratitude for having her in his life. And she thought it was cruel. At least she had that much awareness, he thought bitterly. "But then I remember," Julia continued, her voice hardening, "that I have a right to think about my future too. I've dedicated my entire youth to building a career with an expiration date. I go on insane diets, work out for 2 hours a day, get painful cosmetic procedures, all to maintain this body and this face. Why can't I secure my financial future? Men do it all the time, marrying younger women for status and beauty. I'm just doing the reverse." Camilla nodded thoughtfully. "When you put it like that, it makes sense. It's almost like a job." "It is exactly a job," Julia agreed emphatically. "And I'm very good at what I do. Robert is completely convinced that I'm the woman of his dreams. I know all the right words, all the right gestures. I studied him, Camilla. I know he's insecure about his appearance, so I compliment him on how charming he is. I know he feels misunderstood because he likes things most people find boring, so I pretend to be interested too. I know he's generous and likes to take care of the people he loves, so I let him do it. Let him feel like the provider, the protector." Robert had to put a hand over his mouth to stifle a sound that threatened to escape. Something, between a groan and a scream. Every word from Julia was like watching an autopsy of his relationship, seeing each part dissected and coldly catalogued. He remembered a night when he shared with her his insecurity about getting older, about losing his hair and gaining weight. She had held him and said he was perfect for her. That age and appearance didn't matter. He had cried that night, moved by her acceptance. Now he knew that every tear had been wasted on a performance. Robert gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Every insecurity he had shared with her, every moment of vulnerability, had been catalogued and used against him. She didn't know him. She had studied him like a military strategist studies enemy territory. The car finally reached the area of the city clerk's office. Robert looked for a nearby parking spot and pulled in. For a moment he just sat there, hands still on the wheel, breathing deeply. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. This was it. It was time to end this waking nightmare. He glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Julia was checking her makeup in a compact mirror. Camilla was looking at her phone. Both were completely oblivious to the fact that their lives were about to change drastically. Robert felt a strange calm settle over him. The storm of emotions that had raged inside him throughout the drive settled into a cold, crystalline determination. "Why did we stop here?" Julia asked from the back seat, finally paying attention to their surroundings. "This isn't the way to the mall." Robert slowly took off the baseball cap, then the sunglasses. He smoothed his hair and straightened his posture. When he turned his head slightly to look in, the rearview mirror, his eyes met Julia's. The recognition was instant. All the color drained from Julia's face, leaving it as pale as paper. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, and her mouth fell open in a small O of horror. Camilla, noticing her friend's reaction, looked confusedly between the two. "Robert." Julia's voice came out as a strangled whisper. Her hands began to tremble visibly, and she dropped the compact she was holding. He turned completely in the driver's seat to face her directly. There was no anger on his face, no tears, no despair. Just a cold, determined calm that frightened Julia more than any emotional outburst would have. It was the look of a man who had made an irreversible decision. "Hi, love," he said, his normal voice returning without the previous disguise. "Surprise?" Julia tried to speak, but only incoherent sounds came out of her mouth. Her hands were shaking visibly. Camilla had shrunk into her seat, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Robert, I can explain," Julia finally managed to articulate, her voice failing. "Everything you heard, it was just, we were joking, it was all a joke between friends, you know how it." Robert held up a hand in a calm but firm gesture, asking for silence. "Julia, please don't insult me any more than you already have. I heard every word, every single word, about how I'm boring, old, dull, getting a gut and going bald. About your plans to endure 2 years of marriage to secure half of my fortune. About how I'm naive, needy, desperate, and pathetic. About how you manipulate me by saying the right things. I heard it all." He paused, his voice growing quieter but no less firm. "You described conversations with lawyers, Julia. You calculated exactly how much money you would get and in how much time. You called our marriage a financial investment, so please don't play me for a fool by trying to say it was a joke. At least respect my intelligence now that you've already destroyed my heart." Tears began to stream down Julia's face, but Robert knew now they weren't tears of remorse or love. They were tears of desperation for the fortune that was slipping through her fingers. "Robert, I love you," she tried, her voice breaking. "I really love you. I was just being stupid, talking nonsense. You have to believe me." He shook his head slowly. "No, Julia, you don't love me. And you know what? I thank you for your honesty with Camilla, because I finally heard the truth. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life." Julia tried to move closer, but Robert opened the driver's door. "Get out of the car," he said firmly. "Robert, please, we can talk about this. Get out of the car." His voice was louder now, but still controlled. Julia and Camilla got out of the back seat, both clearly in shock. Robert walked to the door of the city clerk's office and turned to Julia one last time. "I'm going to cancel all the paperwork for our wedding right now. When I'm done here, I don't ever want to see you again. Is that clear?" The sidewalk in front of the municipal building seemed a surreal stage for the end of a relationship. People hurried past, oblivious to the drama unfolding. A hot dog vendor on the corner watched the scene with discreet curiosity. The New York sky began to darken, grey clouds promising rain at any moment. Robert stood at the entrance of the building, watching Julia try to process what had just happened. Tears still streamed down her face, now mixed with an expression of genuine desperation. "Robert, wait," she pleaded, taking a step toward him. "I know I said horrible things, but I was lying to Camilla. I was trying to seem strong, to look like I was in control, but the truth is, I love you. I really love you, and I'm scared to admit it." Robert felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but the pain was still throbbing too strongly for him to be fooled again. He shook his head slowly like a disappointed teacher with a student who insists on lying, even with all the evidence against them. "Julia, you had months to show me who you really were. You chose to show me a lie every single day. You studied my insecurities and used them to manipulate me. That isn't love. That was never love." Camilla remained a few steps behind, visibly uncomfortable, looking at her phone as if she wanted to disappear. Julia turned briefly to her with a look that said, "Help me," but her friend just averted her eyes. She knew there was nothing she could do or say to fix this. "I can change," Julia continued, her voice taking on a more intense tone of desperation. She took a few more steps toward Robert, the tears now falling freely. "I can be the woman you deserve. Please just give me a chance to fix this. We can go to couples therapy, we can talk calmly, I can prove that." "Prove what?" Robert interrupted, his voice still calm but firm as steel. He crossed his arms, creating a physical barrier between them. "That you didn't say I was boring, old, and dull? That you didn't plan exactly how long you'd endure the marriage before filing for divorce? That you didn't call it a financial investment?" "Julia, I heard it all with my own ears. It wasn't taken out of context. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the most honest truth you've ever spoken in your life." People were starting to stare at the scene. An elderly woman with shopping bags slowed her pace, curious. A young couple whispered something as they passed. Robert didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't worried about appearances or what others would think. Julia tried to approach again, reaching out to touch Robert's arm, but he stepped back. "Don't touch me," he said, and there was something in his voice that made Julia freeze. "You've touched me hundreds of times pretending to love me. I don't want any more of it." A woman walking by slowed down, clearly catching fragments of the argument. Robert no longer cared who was listening or watching. For months he had worried so much about appearances, about what people would think, about maintaining the perfect image of a loving couple. Now it all seemed ridiculously irrelevant. "Robert, for God's sake," she tried one last time, her voice now sobbing. The tears smudged her perfectly applied makeup. "We have a history together. 6 months that was so beautiful. You can't just throw it all away because of one moment of weakness." Robert almost laughed at the irony. "A moment of weakness, Julia. You described a detailed plan. You mentioned conversations with lawyers. You calculated exactly how much money you would get. That wasn't a moment of weakness. It was the revelation of who you really are." He took a deep breath, feeling the cool New York air fill his lungs. It was strange, but despite the pain, he felt something else. Relief. A profound relief at having discovered the truth before signing those papers, before legally committing his life to someone who saw him only as a financial transaction. "You know what the saddest part of all this is?" Robert said, his voice lower now, almost intimate. "I really loved you. Not the money you could give me, not your body, not your status as a model. I loved the person I thought you were. I loved the conversations I thought we were having, the moments I believed were genuine. I was building a future in my head with children, with us growing old together, building something real, and it was all based on an illusion you deliberately created." He paused, swallowing hard, and Robert realized his own emotions were finally starting to crack the calm surface he had maintained. "You know what hurts the most? It's not even the betrayal itself. It's knowing that every happy moment I lived with you was a lie. Every time you said, 'I love you,' every time you held my hand, every time you smiled at me, it was all an act. I gave you my real heart and you were just playing a part." Julia was now sobbing uncontrollably, but Robert could no longer tell if they were genuine tears or another performance. "I can be that person for you. I can—" "No," Robert cut her off, his voice growing harder. "You can't be something you never were. And I deserve someone who loves me for real, not someone who has to pretend or change to accept me. I deserve someone who finds my documentaries interesting, or at least respects that I like them. Someone who wants to go to bookstores with me because they genuinely enjoy it, not because they're making a temporary sacrifice for money." He turned to enter the building, but stopped and looked at her one last time. "You know what your mistake was, Julia. You underestimated my intelligence. You called me naive, needy, desperate. But a man doesn't build a $120 million company by being naive. I just chose to believe in you because love made me want to believe. But now, my eyes are open." Inside the city clerk's office, the atmosphere was formal and cold, with white walls and a few chairs lined up in a small waiting area. It smelled of paper and old coffee. Other people waited to be served, some clearly there for happy occasions like birth or marriage registrations, others with more serious expressions. Robert approached the counter, where a middle-aged clerk greeted him with a professional smile. "Good afternoon, how can I help you?" "Good afternoon," Robert replied, taking his ID from his wallet with hands that were now trembling slightly. The adrenaline that had kept him calm during the confrontation was starting to fade. "My name is Robert Ashton. I applied for a marriage license a few weeks ago. I need to cancel everything." The clerk typed some information into her computer, her face maintaining professional neutrality, even as she must have noticed the tension in Robert's voice and possibly heard part of the argument outside. "Let me check. Yes, I've found it. Robert Ashton and Julia Matthews, wedding scheduled for 12 days from now. Are you sure you wish to cancel? Once it's cancelled, you'll have to restart the entire process if you change your minds." "I am absolutely certain," Robert said without hesitation. "Please cancel everything." The clerk nodded and began to process the cancellation. Robert signed a few documents, stamped others, and in less than half an hour, all legal records of his future marriage to Julia had been officially voided. When he received the cancellation receipt in his hands, he felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. While waiting for the final papers, Robert watched a young couple in the corner of the room, laughing softly as they filled out marriage forms. They couldn't have been more than 25, and the way they looked at each other was so genuine, so pure that Robert felt a mix of nostalgia and hope. They had what he thought he had with Julia, but unlike him, he hoped their love was true for both of them. Upon leaving the office, Julia was still there, sitting on the curb. Camilla had disappeared, probably having hailed a cab or an Uber to escape the uncomfortable situation. Julia looked up when she saw Robert exit, and he could see she still held out hope of reversing the situation. "It's over," he said simply, holding up the paper. "Officially, there is no longer any wedding being planned between us." Julia stood up unsteadily, wiping her face with her hands, her makeup now completely smeared. She seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than the confident model Robert had known. "So now what? You're just going to leave me here and go on with your life as if I never existed?" Robert considered the question for a moment, tilting his head slightly. "No, you'll always have existed, and this experience will exist too. But now I know what to look for. I know what signs to watch for. You taught me a valuable lesson, Julia, though not in the way you planned." He walked to the car, feeling his legs weak, but his determination strong. Before getting in, he turned one last time. Julia stood there, a solitary figure on the sidewalk, and for a brief second, Robert felt that pang of compassion again. But then he remembered her words in the car, the coldness with which she had calculated every detail of her betrayal, and the compassion dissolved. "One thing I have to tell you," he said, his voice firm but not cruel. "You are beautiful, yes. You know how to use the right words, how to manipulate feelings. But beauty fades, Julia, and when it does, what will be left because you haven't built anything real inside yourself, just tricks and strategies, and that's something no spa or cosmetic treatment can fix." Julia didn't reply. She just stood there, motionless on the sidewalk, watching Robert get into the car and drive away. In the rearview mirror, he watched her shrink until she was just a distant figure, and then disappear completely as he turned the corner. The drive back to his apartment was silent. Robert didn't turn on the radio, didn't answer the calls that started coming in on his phone. He just drove, letting his mind process everything that had happened in the last few hours. The pain was there, sharp and real, but along with it came something else: clarity. The New York traffic was surprisingly light for that time of day. Robert drove past Times Square, observing the illuminated buildings, the people rushing through their lives, each with their own dramas and joys. He was just one among millions, and there was something oddly comforting in that. His pain was enormous to him, but the world kept spinning indifferent. When he stopped at a red light, Robert finally allowed the tears to come. They streamed silently down his face as he gripped the steering wheel, sobbing softly in the privacy of his car. They weren't just tears of pain, but also of relief, of anger, of disappointment in himself for having been so blind, and strangely, even of gratitude for having discovered the truth in time. When he arrived at his building, he greeted the doorman with a nod and went up to his apartment. The familiar walls, the furniture he had carefully chosen, the books on his shelves, everything felt different now. The apartment was silent, but it wasn't the lonely silence he feared. It was a silence of possibilities, of new beginnings. Robert went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. He drank it slowly, feeling the cool liquid go down his throat. Then he walked out onto the balcony and watched New York light up with the evening lights. The city was huge, full of millions of stories happening simultaneously. His was just one more, but it was his story, and he still had control over how it would continue. His phone rang again. It was Michael, his partner and friend. Robert hesitated for a moment before answering. "Robert, finally, man, where are you? Julia called me hysterical, saying you two broke up, that you cancelled the wedding. What happened?" Robert let out a long sigh. "Michael, you were right about everything. I found out who she really is, and it's nothing like what I thought." "Damn," Michael's voice sounded genuinely concerned. "Are you okay? Do you want me to come over?" "No," Robert replied after a moment's thought. "I need to be alone tonight, to process all this. But thank you for always trying to warn me, even when I didn't want to listen. That's what friends are for, man. Look, when you're ready to talk, I'm here. And Robert, you did the right thing. I don't know exactly what happened, but if you cancelled the wedding, I'm sure you had very good reasons." After hanging up, Robert went to his office and picked up the book of poetry he had given Julia. She had returned it along with a few of her other things that had been at his apartment, probably hoping it would help win him back. He opened it to the first page and read the dedication he had written. The words that had seemed so meaningful months ago now sounded naive, almost pathetic. "For Julia, who brought poetry into my life and taught me that love can be as beautiful as the verses I so admire. With all my heart, Robert." He ran his fingers over the words, feeling the texture of the fine paper. Robert walked out to the balcony with the book in his hands. The city stretched out before him, millions of lights twinkling like an ocean of terrestrial stars. He thought about throwing the book away, of getting rid of everything that reminded him of Julia. But then he realized the book wasn't to blame. Robert Frost wasn't to blame. The poetry would remain beautiful and true, regardless of who received it. He closed the book carefully and placed it back on the shelf, but this time in the section that was just his, no longer in the area for gifts he had given. It would be a reminder, not of Julia, but of a lesson learned, a physical bookmark for a chapter of his life that was now over, painful but necessary. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment of the relationship, re-evaluating every gesture, every word, searching for the signs he should have seen. They were all there, he realized. The small inconsistencies, the moments when Julia's enthusiasm seemed forced, the times she changed the subject when he talked about the long-term future. But love, or what he had thought was love, had painted everything in rosy colors, making him ignore the red flags waving right before his eyes. 3 months had passed since that transformative day in the car. Robert still remembered every word, every detail of the conversation that had changed the course of his life. But now the pain had morphed into something different. It was no longer the acute agony of the first few days, when he could barely sleep, when every object in his apartment reminded him of the plans he had made with Julia. It was no longer that sleepless night after the confrontation, when he spent hours re-evaluating every moment of the relationship, searching for the signs he should have seen. Now it was a more mature ache, accompanied by gratitude for having discovered the truth in time. The first few days after cancelling the wedding were brutal. Robert had to call all the vendors, cancel the mansion in the Hamptons, get deposits back and explain to friends and family what had happened. His mother, a simple woman from rural Ohio, cried on the phone not for the loss of Julia, but for the pain she knew her son was feeling. "My son," she said in her sweet, strong voice, "sometimes God protects us in ways we don't understand at the time. You'll find someone who truly deserves you." Robert threw himself into his work for the first few weeks. Meetings, new projects, company expansions. Michael was worried about the intensity, but Robert explained that he needed to keep his mind busy. At night, however, when he returned to the empty apartment, the loneliness hit hard. He found himself thinking not specifically of Julia, but of the idea of having someone, of the dream of companionship that now seemed distant. A rainy Tuesday in July changed everything. Robert had left the office early and decided on impulse to visit a traditional bookstore in Greenwich Village that he loved but hadn't frequented in months. The place was special, with old wooden shelves, the mixed scent of new and used books, and a small cafe in the back that served the best espresso in the city. He was in the American literature section, flipping through a rare edition of a Faulkner novel, when he accidentally bumped into someone. "I'm sorry," he said automatically, looking up. The woman standing next to him was about 35, with wavy brown hair tied in a messy bun, discreetly framed glasses, and a gentle smile. She wore a simple burgundy blouse and jeans, and was carrying a tote bag already full of books. "No, my fault," she replied. "I was so focused on finding a specific edition that I didn't see you there." Robert smiled, and it was a genuine smile, the first in weeks. "Which edition are you looking for? Maybe I can help. I know this bookstore pretty well." The woman's eyes lit up. "Really? I'm looking for an annotated edition of The Sound and the Fury. I'm going to use it with my students next semester and wanted something with good explanatory notes." "You're a professor?" Robert asked, genuinely interested. "Of American literature," she replied, extending her hand. "Marina Costa." "Robert Ashton," he said, shaking her hand. The touch was brief but warm. "And I think I know where you can find what you're looking for. The owner keeps the special editions in a separate section." He guided her through the bookstore to a more hidden shelf in the back, where there was indeed an annotated edition of Faulkner. Marina picked up the book with reverent care, flipping through the pages with the attention of someone who truly appreciated literature. "Perfect," she murmured. "My students will love this. Thank you so much." "Where do you teach?" Robert asked, realizing he didn't want the conversation to end there. "At NYU," Marina replied. "Contemporary American literature and modern classics. What about you? You seem to know your way around books." Robert gave a slightly shy smile. "I'm more of an enthusiastic reader than an expert. I work in tech, but in my free time, I live among books. Literature is my escape." Marina smiled back, and there was something so genuine in that smile that it made Robert's heart beat a little faster. "I always say the best people I know are readers. There's something about those who choose to spend time with books that indicates depth. They walk to the checkout together, talking about their favorite authors." Robert discovered that Marina loved documentaries as much as he did, especially about history and art. When she mentioned she had recently watched a series on the history of Russian literature, he felt a connection he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Look," Robert said as they stood at the bookstore's entrance, the rain outside creating a curtain of water. "I know we just met, but would you like to get a coffee? Right here in the cafe. It's raining so hard it might be worth waiting it out a bit." Marina hesitated, for only a second before smiling. "I'd love that." They spent 2 hours talking in the small cafe. Robert spoke about his company, about how he had started from nothing and built his success. Marina told him about her passion for teaching, about how she loved seeing students fall in love with authors she adored. The conversation flowed naturally, without forcing, without pretense. It was only when Marina mentioned a line from Robert Frost that Robert felt a tightness in his chest. He told her for the first time to someone who wasn't family or a close friend about the relationship that had ended 3 months ago. He didn't go into all the painful details, but he explained that he had discovered the person he thought he loved was not who she pretended to be. Marina listened attentively, without judgment. "You know," she said after a moment of silence. "I think sometimes the most painful disappointments are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. You found out what you don't want, and that's just as important as finding out what you do want." Robert was struck by the wisdom in her words. "Have you been through something similar?" Marina nodded. "A few years ago, I realized I was in a relationship where I was putting in far more effort than the other person. When we broke up, it hurt. But afterward, I realized I could finally find someone who would value me for real, not out of obligation, but by genuine choice." They exchanged numbers at the end of that afternoon. Robert left the bookstore feeling something he hadn't felt in months: hope. It wasn't the sweeping, illusory passion he had felt for Julia. It was something softer, more real, more promising, precisely because it was built on an honest foundation. That night, Robert called his mother. "Mum, I think I met someone special today," he said, his voice carrying a lightness she hadn't heard in a long time. His mother, Teresa, felt her heart warm on the other end of the line. "Tell me about it, son." Robert described the meeting in the bookstore, the conversation about books, the coffee that stretched on for hours. "You know what's different, Mum? I didn't feel that anxiety to impress, to be someone I'm not. I was just myself, and she seemed to like me for exactly that." His mother sighed in relief. "That's real love, Robert, when you can be yourself without fear." In the following weeks, Robert and Marina began to see each other regularly. They went to art exhibitions, watched documentaries together, had dinner at quiet restaurants where they could talk for hours. Marina introduced him to the academic world she loved, taking him to lectures at the university and literary debates that fascinated him. Robert shared his world of entrepreneurship and innovation with her, but never in a showy or arrogant way. He realized that Marina was impressed not by the size of his company, but by his work ethic and his passion for building something meaningful. On one of their dates, Robert took Marina to meet Mr. Anthony and his wife, who had since recovered. The elderly couple welcomed the professor with warmth, and during a simple lunch at their home in Queens, Mr. Anthony pulled Robert aside. "Mr. Ashton, this young lady is different from the other one. You can see in her eyes that her feelings are true." Robert smiled, grateful for the confirmation of what his heart already knew. Mr. Anthony continued, "That day I asked for off, it changed everything, didn't it? If I had been working, maybe you never would have found out the truth." Robert hugged his driver gratefully. "You saved me without even knowing it, Mr. Anthony. For that and so many other things, you're much more than an employee to me. You're family." They were different, but their differences complemented each other instead of clashing. One evening, 2 months after that first meeting in the bookstore, they were at Robert's apartment. Marina had cooked a simple but delicious dinner, and now they were in the living room, she reading a book on the sofa while he worked on some reports on his laptop. It was a quiet, domestic scene without glamour or excitement, but Robert realized it was exactly what he had always wanted. "Marina," he said suddenly, making her look up from her book, "I need to thank you." "For what?" she asked, marking her page and closing the book. "For showing me what's real," Robert replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For liking me exactly as I am. For not pretending to be interested in the things I love, but genuinely appreciating them. For making me realize that love doesn't have to be a hurricane that sweeps you away. It can be something calmer, deeper, more enduring." Marina got up and walked over to him, perching on the arm of his chair. "Robert, I would never pretend to be something I'm not. I like your documentaries because I genuinely find them interesting. I love our conversations about books because you have fascinating insights. I like you, not your bank account or your status. I like the man who chooses to stay home reading poetry instead of going to loud parties." Robert felt his eyes well up with tears, but this time they were good tears. He pulled Marina into a long, tight hug. "I was starting to think there was no one out there who could love me like this." "There is," Marina whispered, "and you deserve it. You always have." That night, as Marina slept beside him, Robert looked at the ceiling and reflected on the past few months. The pain of Julia's betrayal still existed, but now it was just a scar, a reminder of a lesson learned. He thought about how different his life could have been if he hadn't had the idea to disguise himself as a driver that day. He would have married Julia, lived in an illusion for 2 years, maybe more, until the inevitable divorce happened and left him even more broken. Robert got up carefully so as not to wake Marina and walked out to the balcony. New York slept below, its lights twinkling like terrestrial stars. He thought of all the versions of himself that had existed over those months: the blind, infatuated man, the betrayed, broken man, and now the rebuilt, wiser man. Each phase had been necessary to get here. He picked up his phone and wrote in his personal notes, something he did when he wanted to record important thoughts. Today I learned that true love doesn't demand you be less than you are. It invites you to be more. Marina doesn't want me to change my passions or hide my quirks. She fell for the man who reads poetry and watches documentaries about astrophysics. That is liberating in a way I never imagined possible. But fate, or luck, or simply an impulsive decision had saved him. And more than that, it had put him on the path to someone who was truly worth it. A few days later, Robert was in a meeting when his phone buzzed with a social media notification. It was a photo of Julia, smiling next to an older man at a corporate event. The caption said something about new beginnings and true love. Robert recognized the man from business magazines, another wealthy entrepreneur, this one over 50. He showed the photo to Michael, who was in the meeting with him. His friend made a face. "Some people never change, huh?" Robert just nodded. "No, but I have. And that's what matters." He paused for a moment, then continued. "You know, Michael, I used to feel angry when I thought about Julia. Angry for being deceived, angry that she wasted my time, angry that she hurt my heart. But now I just feel pity. Pity because she'll never experience what it's like to truly love someone. She'll spend her life collecting fortunes but will never have the wealth that really matters." Michael smiled, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "You're really over it, and Marina is very lucky to have found you." Robert laughed. "I think I'm the lucky one. She taught me that I don't have to be different from who I am to be loved. That's worth more than any fortune." That conversation stayed with Robert. He realized that forgiveness, even for someone who had hurt him so deeply, was liberating. Not a forgiveness that forgot or excused what Julia had done, but one that allowed him to move on without carrying the weight of bitterness. That night he took Marina to dinner at a special restaurant, not for its prices or exclusivity, but because it served the best BBQ in Brooklyn, and she had mentioned she loved it. As they ate and laughed about silly stories from their day, Robert realized he was finally building something real. Not an illusion based on appearances and lies, but a genuine connection based on respect, shared interests, and true affection. Months later, when Robert told Marina the whole story with Julia, including every painful detail of the conversation in the car, she held him tight and said, "You know what I think? I think that had to happen for you to get here, for you to get to us. Sometimes life gives us gifts wrapped in sad paper." Robert agreed. Julia would continue her life, searching for the next target, the next wealthy man to manipulate. But he, Robert, had found something infinitely more valuable, someone who loved him not in spite of his boring tastes or his average appearance, but precisely for being who he was. Marina didn't see a bank account or a 2-year investment in him. She saw a partner, an equal, someone with whom to build a life based on truth. A year after that fateful day in the car, Robert and Marina were in the Hamptons, not for a lavish wedding with 200 guests, but for a quiet weekend at a cozy inn. They were walking hand in hand through the seaside town streets, when Robert stopped in front of a small jewelry store. "Want to go in?" he asked with a smile Marina knew well. Inside the shop, he chose 2 simple gold bands, without extravagant diamonds or astronomical price tags. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Marina. Not with pomp or giant parties, but with truth and companionship. Will you marry me?" Marina, with tears in her eyes, simply nodded. There, in that small jewelry store, with no photographers or witnesses besides the emotional saleswoman, they sealed a commitment, far more real than any grand ceremony could ever have been. And as the sun set over New York City, casting golden hues over the city he loved so much, Robert knew with certainty that he had made the right decision on that fateful day. The truth, however painful, would always be better than the most comfortable of lies. That night, Robert opened the Robert Frost book he had given to Julia and that she had returned without ever reading. He remembered how, on that first night after the confrontation, he had considered throwing it away, erasing the naive dedication he had written. But now, months later, he was grateful he had kept it. On the first page, he carefully erased the old dedication and wrote a new one, this time for Marina. For the one who loves the verses as much as I do, and who taught me that true love is not feigned, but lived. With all my heart, Robert. He smiled as he closed the book, knowing that this time it would be read, cherished, and kept with genuine affection. He thought of all the lessons that painful experience had taught him. He learned that love should not require you to hide who you are. He learned that genuine compatibility is worth more than dazzling appearances. He learned that the patience to find the right person is infinitely better than the rush to fill a void. And most importantly, he learned that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are portals to the best chapters yet to come. Robert looked at Marina, who was reading peacefully on his sofa, and silently thanked that day in the car, that impulsive decision to disguise himself as a driver, that devastating conversation that shattered his illusions but saved his future, because without that pain, he would never have found this peace. Without that exposed lie, he would never have discovered this truth. And without Julia leaving his life, Marina would never have entered it.